60 Minutes Rewind.
One of the biggest and least expected foreign policy problems facing President-elect Bush will be how to deal with the reported power struggle said to be brewing currently at the highest levels of the Chinese government. A struggle between the traditional hardliners and the reformers who want to make their government more democratic. As proof of that power struggle, several China scholars here in the U.S. tell us that senior Communist Party officials have just smuggled out of Beijing transcripts that had remained secret for 11 years. These transcripts, being published as the Tiananmen Papers, document what was going on behind the scenes at the highest levels of the Chinese government back when the rest of the world was watching this. 1989. A young man stands up to a column of tanks and survives the encounter. But across Beijing, hundreds, perhaps thousands, are killed as troops retake Tiananmen Square from student protesters calling for freedom of the press, freedom of speech, an end to corruption. The crackdown came after bitter debates among China's top leaders over whether to use force. But before we get to that, let's refresh our memory about the uprising in Beijing. The students began demonstrating after the death of a top government reformer they deeply admired. And when hundreds of them started a hunger strike, a large CBS News team had arrived in Beijing, including correspondent John Sheehan.
The hunger strikers marched into the city, supported by thousands of their schoolmates. Their banners bore dramatic slogans such as, "It's great to live, but die with honor."
Within just a few days, hundreds of the hunger strikers began collapsing and were taken to hospitals.
Is it worth dying?
Yeah, absolutely.
As the protests continued into their fifth week and spread to more than 300 cities throughout China, the government declared martial law and brought troops into the outskirts of Beijing as a show of force, a warning to the students.
Soldiers are now massing to move against the protesters, camped right here in the center of Beijing.
And with a possible bloody confrontation imminent, China's leaders decided to pull the plug on CBS News live television reports.
These are the last pictures we'll be showing to you through our own facilities, and if we're able to show any more at all, I know not when. This is Dan Rather, CBS News, Beijing.
Though the networks couldn't go live, they could still send taped reports, as Bruce Morton did, after the demonstrators moved a giant statue into the square, a statue they called the Goddess of Democracy.
They hoped it would fire up their movement, and it did. By Tuesday night, Tiananmen Square was full of people looking, admiring.
But 3 days after the goddess arrived on the scene, and a full 7 weeks after the protests began, Deng Xiaoping ordered his troops to clear and retake Tiananmen Square. He had no idea how difficult that would be. Correspondent Richard Roth.
The People's Army, surrounded by the people, turned back in its tracks a few hundred yards from Tiananmen Square. "Without fighting, you lost the battle," a civilian shouted to the troops in retreat. Victory was celebrated on the street and in the square where the demonstrators are still encamped.
Furious, Deng Xiaoping sent more armed troops and tanks into Beijing and ordered them to take over Tiananmen Square within 24 hours. As they closed in, Richard Roth reported from the square on his cell phone.
Now people are running away from the gunfire, from the advancing troops. There are students running behind them, throwing rocks, picking up debris from the concrete on the square, and hurling it at the soldiers. You hear that gunfire?
We do hear it.
They're coming for us. We're trying to move back and move away. I'll go!
This is a CBS News special report. From CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Bob Schieffer.
And we want to go immediately to Richard Roth in Tiananmen Square. The troops were moving toward him at last report. What's happening, Dick?
Hello, this is New York. Does anybody hear us?
We have just lost communication with Richard Roth.
And it was then that all across Beijing, blood began to flow. Now let's move ahead 11 years to 2001. As we've said, according to several China scholars, a new battle between the hardliners and the reformers is heating up inside the government. They say that highly placed government officials helped smuggle out of China the secret transcripts of bitter debates among the top leaders about whether to use force against the students. The transcripts evolved from meticulous notes taken by secretaries during the debates. And Professor Andrew Nathan of Columbia University says the release of these documents now seems to be a deliberate affront to China's president, Jiang Zemin.
In my judgment, this is a sign of an intense power struggle, much more intense than the outside world appreciates. It looks as if Jiang Zemin is in control, but I can assure you if Jiang Zemin were in control, these documents would not be published. Somebody very high inside the Chinese government wants documents to come out that are the crown jewel secrets of the Chinese political system. You don't find these documents by going through the trash in Beijing.
And this is the man who smuggled the transcripts out. He still considers himself a loyal member of the Communist Party, but he insisted we conceal his identity and use a different voice because he hopes to return to China. At what risk are you putting yourself, personally, by bringing this material out to the United States?
It's probably hard for Westerners to understand the degree of the risk that I've undertaken.
You could wind up in prison for the rest of your life. Why were you willing to take this risk?
At the time of the events, I saw corpses. I saw a depressed mood among the public. I saw a split in the top leadership. Yet there's been no way to raise the question and to bring it out. And I went through this publication to try to open up this question in China.
He believes that this new debate over Tiananmen will discredit the hardliners who had backed the crackdown. He brought the transcripts to Professor Nathan and two other top China scholars who tell us they painstakingly authenticated them but will not give us details or tell us anything else about this man to protect his identity, they say. James Lilly was the U.S. ambassador to Beijing as Tiananmen unfolded. He has read the transcripts, believes them to be authentic, and says they show how the hardliners pressured Deng Xiaoping to crack down.
Deng was persuaded by his inner circle that this was directed against him. And these people were telling Deng, don't you know how we seized power? A single spark lights a prairie fire, and it just takes off.
A month into the student protests, according to the transcripts, Deng tells the top leaders, anarchy gets worse every day. If this continues, we could even end up under house arrest.
He had been in house arrest before.
Yeah.
He spent a good part of the Cultural Revolution in a shed, and he said, they ain't gonna do it to me again.
As Deng grew more anxious, the top hardliners began to assert themselves, led by Li Peng, the number 2 man in the government.
From the beginning, he wants this thing stopped. It's very unhealthy. He has no time for these patriotic students.
And retired General Wang Zhen agreed. According to the transcripts, he urged Deng to crack down, and here's the quote. Give him no mercy. These kids don't know how good they've got it. When we were their age, we lived in a forest of rifles and a rain of bullets. We didn't know what a peaceful day was. Now they want to go starve themselves. Anyone who tries to overthrow the Communist Party deserves death and no burial.
He can hardly control his anger, and that was always his attitude.
As is well known, the opposing view was led by Zhao Ziyang, who was then head of the Communist Party and head of the government. And he did not want to use force against the students, but he was overruled by Deng Xiaoping.
He also was pushing for recognition of the student movement, the organizations. He was for a freer press. He was for a more open system. But he lost.
Still, Zhao Ziyang visited the students in Tiananmen Square and tearfully told them that he had come too late, and he begged them to go home. The transcripts show why Zhao was so emotional, that just hours earlier, Zhao had lost the power struggle. Deng Xiaoping had decided to crack down.
That was the night when the decision had been made to declare martial law the next day. Zhao knew that, but of course the students didn't know it. And Zhao knew that he was going to be out of power because he was not going to go along with the martial law decision.
The story will continue after this.
Today, Zhao Ziyang remains under house arrest. And now it appears that like-minded reformers within the Communist Party are today trying to improve the prospects for democracy by using the transcripts to embarrass the hardliners before President Jiang Zemin steps down next year.
There are people, I believe, who feel that you need a change of leadership in 2002, and they think it needs a good injection of fresh blood and fresh thinking.
So, Jiang Zemin is supposed to quit 2002, except he wants to keep his post as, in effect, chairman of the army.
That's right. It looks like he does, but it looks like people are fighting very hard not to let that happen.
Meantime, Li Peng, still the government's number 2, appears now to be the number 1 target of the reformers.
Li Peng knows this is coming, and that he is arming himself against it with documents, films even, docudramas, that defend his position that he saved China. He had no choice but to do what he did. Mm-hmm. So in that intrigue at the top in China, people are smelling out each other.
There's a power struggle over the whole future direction of China. Do we go back to what Zhao Ziyang advocated and which he failed to carry out in 1989? Do we get back onto that track of evolution? That's the really big struggle over the future of China, and that's what these papers are about.
According to those papers, here's what Zhao Ziyang told the top leaders 11 years ago. We need to accelerate the reform of our political system, he said, make it more democratic. If the Communist Party doesn't hold up the banner of reform, someone else will, and the party will lose out. And tonight, that is still the message of top party reformers who, at great personal risk, have made the transcripts public.